the newsagents.
We may be a day late, but it is now time for your questions.
Better late than never, John.
Better late than never. And we're going to start with this one from Matt. Hi there, my question is, you're a Labour leader on a campaign visit to a pub. When encouraged, do you down your pint or not?
Down it, down it, down it. Just to do the John Sopel. 3 at once.
In one go?
In one go. The problem is you set a precedent then, don't you? And then you people say do it again, and before you know where you are, you're pissed.
And you're Ed Davey. And you're doing photo stunts.
Maybe that explains it.
Yes.
Maybe Ed is just drunk.
What you can't do is say, no, I won't have a pint, I'll have a half a shandy, because that looks wimpish.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you've got to do it, haven't you? I mean, unless you're a teetotal, obviously, in which case you're fine and you just say, I'll have a lemonade or whatever it happens to be.
There's a great clip of Margaret Thatcher visiting Coronation Street, and she's asked what she'd like to drink. And she's like, oh, I'll have a bitter lemon, dear. I'll have a bitter lemon. I'm on duty. So if you're the Thatcher, you go for the Schweppes rather than the Tetleys.
Although I suspect if Dennis Thatcher were there with her, he'd have had a double gin and tonic.
Didn't expect to mention Margaret Thatcher and Schweppes bitter lemon quite so early on in this election Q&A special. Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And we're going to start with a voice note from Tom.
I want to know why no one's challenging Labour on their tax plans for independent schools. With an estimated 500,000 children in the private education system, if even a third have to stop attending, then that's over 150,000 places that have to be found in an under-resourced, underfunded state system that currently can't deal with it. And so that is not to the benefit of state school children. It's not to benefit to the hard-working families who have sacrificed a lot to be able to give their kids this education, as the rich will still always be able to afford it. It means that if a third of the schools end up closing, then the estimated £1.4 billion that they want to raise from it won't be as much. And also, it will raise house prices in the catchment areas even more than they already are. So it seems to be ideologically driven rather than practical to the benefit of all. So I'm wondering why no one's challenging them on it.
Well, maybe it's because well, thanks for the question, Tom. And I do know that there are a lot of parents and families who are worried about it. But I don't know. My sympathy for private schools, particularly the top private schools, it's probably up there with my sympathy. I don't know, for the Hooties or someone like that, because we're in a situation where if you look at the grand sweep of what's happened over the last 20 years, actually the real story behind this, and if you send your kids to private schools, then you will feel this, is that in real terms, private school fees since 2003 have gone up by 55%. Right? There has been an enormous amount of profiteering in the private school system. Why? Well, you will know because many of the people who would have once sent their kids to private schools, sort of, doctors, accountants, sort of solidly upper middle class kind of people, can no longer do so because they've been priced out of it. Why? Because most of these schools, particularly the top public schools, have started to cater and appeal instead for the sons and daughters of the global mega rich, the oligarchs and so on. And so in real terms, the resources of these schools has gone up enormously, right? And yet we're told by these schools that they cannot afford to absorb the cost of VAT and not pass it on to the parents. I find that very, very unlikely. And in a situation with Labour, where, they're not going to raise huge amounts from this, but like 1.6 to 1.8 billion, it's not nothing. And in a situation where they're not raising lots of revenue from other sources, it matters. My only other thing to say is this. I mean, I do find it quite funny when parents say things like, who send their kids to private schools, they say, well, look, if I have to pay VAT on these fees, I'm not going to be able to afford it. I mean, it's a bit like me saying, I'd love a Bentley and I could afford it, but not if I have to pay VAT on it, not if I have to pay the tax on it. Well, where's my tiny little violin, I'm afraid?
Yes. I mean, I suppose the other point I've heard, I saw a headline saying this is a tax on parents. You think, yeah, we pay a lot of tax on a lot of things. Why should this particular thing be...
We pay tax on almost everything,
exactly,
apart from the absolute essentials.
And, you think of the row that there was over whether sort of children's clothes were going to be subject to VAT or kind of heating fuel was going to be subject to VAT. Why has there been this ring fencing of private education, which is a choice? And there is a state, there is a state education system which arguably would be much improved by the integration of the articulate, well-to-do professional classes in a classroom. I'm not, advocating social engineering here, but there is an argument which says it it's not a basic human right that Labour are trying to challenge. I can see that it will be uncomfortable. But just as we have a government that is saying repeatedly, look at the savings we can make with efficiencies, I wonder whether a few of those private schools could make some savings with efficiencies and not have to pass the 20% of VAT on to parents who want their kids to go to those schools.
What about Tarquin's little field trip to Lima? Well, I might have to send a few extra kids on it as well. I'm being facetious, but honestly, it is the point that you've just made, John, which is that, these schools, as I say, have had lots of extra resources because of the extra the prices they've been charging. I think there is a lot of scaremongering going on by the private sector schooling lobby, and I think that when push comes to shove, yes, there may be some changes around the edges, particularly for some of the cheaper schools, which might be unfortunate, but I suspect that the behavioural changes will not be that substantial, and actually in most cases the schools will either absorb the costs or find ways, or they ought to be able to find ways to absorb the costs.
I suppose one funny ironic thing I suspect about all of this is that if we look at where Labour support has often been strongest now, it is often in areas where kind of the affluent middle class professional university towns where there probably are a number of independent day schools and the like, which I'm not sure how worried cephalogically Labour should be about this, about there being a massive blowback.
No, I don't think it's going to be a big problem. But I understand that, there will be parents who are concerned about it. Anna says, hi all, long-time listener and admirer of the podcast. I have a few election questions. One, what do you think of Labour's plans of changing the voting age to 16 to 17? Is it achievable? And if it is passed, what impact may it have on the makeup of Parliament, if any?
Well, I have a slight reluctance because I don't think you have enough of a stake in society yet at age 16 or to kind of have a vote. Now, I fully accept that, you shouldn't be able to die for your country and not have a vote. That's sort of my bottom line. If you can join the army, then you should be able to vote in an election. I mean, what difference would it make? Well, if you look at polling evidence, older people vote Conservative, younger people kind of are more liberal-minded, and the latest polls suggest that support for the Conservatives among the under 50s is absolutely minimal, and it kind of and support for Labour goes up and up and up the younger it gets. The other side to it, though, is what percentage of young people go and vote. Are you committed to?
I'm perfectly comfortable with it. Yeah, and actually the thing about the stake in society thing, I know what you mean, but it is an argument that was basically used against almost every extension of the franchise that's ever happened. I mean, it was literally what was said about women, working class people, the middle classes. Like at each and every stage, it's always been said these people don't have enough of a stake in society, and you could argue it the other way around, right? Like if 16 and 17-year-olds have been allowed to vote in the Brexit referendum, they're still living with Brexit in a way that, frankly, a lot of the people who voted for Brexit in 2016 are no longer with us. And we're living with the consequences of their decision. So, I don't know. I don't think... I'm comfortable with it.
I want to know whether the Lewis Goodall voting system would say 16-year-olds can vote. If you're near death's door, forget it. You haven't got one.
I think the Lewis Goodall voting system would allow all 16 to 17-year-olds to vote, apart from those in private schools who, frankly, have...
Not that you've got a hobby horse or anything like that.
No. But I think, to answer the question directly, it would help Labour a bit, which is why... one of the reasons why they're doing it. If it was polling the other way around dramatically, Labour wouldn't be doing it.
Yes. And you just look at, and you can just look at the policies in this election. Look at triple lock plus.
Well, but that's what I mean. That's a reason.
Just purely designed for the elderly, because they go out and vote in large numbers.
But isn't that a reason to have a bit of a corrective and reduce the franchise threshold a little bit to try and rebalance things? So that's why I'd be comfortable with it.
I suppose, but if you're 16 years old and you're still at school, are you interested in fiscal policy?
It's already happening in Scotland.
Are you interested in monetary policy?
It's happened in Scotland already. It's happened in Wales. So it's just updating. And to answer the question about is it achievable, it's very achievable. You just pass that act of Parliament, and as has happened many times, and change the vote. Or we've got another question from Jack.
Hey up, news agents. It's Jack here, living in Leeds. My question is, with Jeremy Corbyn standing as an independent and Diane Abbott potentially being forced to stand as an independent if she wants to continue as MP, my question is, do you think democracy in this country would be better or worse, or how do you think Parliament would be changed if more independents won at a general election in a similar way to how they do at local elections? Because I don't know. Cheers to
Jack, thank you so much.
We should have more. We should start every show with A up. Or ta-ra. Get Emily saying, hey up. Ta-ra. Ta-ra for now, everybody.
She's not here to defend herself, Lewis. You're misbehaving. You're going to be in trouble next week when she's back. So I kind of think about this, that, yeah, it would be great, but the first past the post system mitigates against independence. Martin Bell won in Tatton in 97.
Anti-corruption candidate. Former BBC war correspondent who I once got absolutely pissed with in Bosnia, but that's a whole other story. Oh, no. Go on.
I had to broadcast the next morning and promptly throw up at the studio because I'd drunk too much.
Presumably he wasn't wearing his white suit famously then.
No, he was wearing his white...
Oh, really? With a bit of your vomit on it? Right,
no, not with my vomit on it. Because he was standing against Neil Hamilton, who was the Conservative MP and had been caught up in the whole cash for questions and a whole mountain of sleaze allegations. And so in those very unique circumstances, Labour and the Liberal Democrats decided not to field a candidate against him. So it was Martin Bell, anti-sleaze candidate, versus the sitting Conservative MP. But that tends not to happen. So, yeah, I think more independent-minded people would be great. I think the voting system mitigates against it.
So I think it would be terrible in the main. There might be specific ones like you say, John, but seriously, I mean, like, political parties get a bad name, right? But like, try and imagine a democracy without political parties. Imagine like political parties were banned, right? And there were just lists and lists of independents. That is impossible. It's impossible for two reasons. It's impossible for us to vote as voters. Because what are political parties, right? Basically, what they are is a very neat sorting mechanism. You don't have to think too hard about each individual candidate's individual policies, because you broadly know, when you go into the voting booth, that you broadly know what Labour stands for, you broadly know what the Conservatives stand for, and so on, right? So it makes it easier for you as a voter to basically assign your preference, right? So that's number one. But also, even if it wasn't just about the voters, how would Parliament work? Parliaments around the world, there's a reason that political parties basically exist in virtually every legislature of the world. It's because you need to have a group of like-minded parliamentarians who broadly agree on the fundamentals of politics to organise your parliament, how we're going to be voting, whipping, all of this stuff that gets a bad name. Without it, parliamentary chambers, parliamentary democracies just start to fall apart. Look at the Senate in a way. I mean, that's got parties, sure, but there's so much more emphasis placed in the American Senate on kind of the power of the individual senator. They can filibuster and so on. What happens? Deadlock. You can't basically get anything done. Super hard to get legislation through. So parties perform a vital part of our democracy. It would be completely exhausting if we didn't have them and impossible to manage.
But why do we then venerate the independent-minded MP who doesn't follow the party line? We love the rebels. We love those who kind of
do, yeah.
And I think the public tend to like, the party figure who is a Labour MP but isn't afraid to poke their leader in the ribs or whatever.
But you know what? I would actually say, at the risk of being slightly, well, not even contrarian, because I think this, like, actually, it's very easy to be the maverick. It's very easy to be the person who, speaks your mind and you get sort of venerated for speaking your mind. And we do need them. It can be a good thing. But also, you know what? There is a certain honour and nobility, which very rarely gets talked about, to being the party man or woman who gets elected as a Labour MP or a Conservative MP, and they know that actually they are getting elected because they've got the Conservative or Labour banner next to their name. Very rarely is anyone in British politics really elected as an individual. And so there is a certain honour to basically, when you've been elected with a Labour whip or the Conservative whip, you do what the party tells you, because that is what the public have voted for. And not only that, but there is a certain honour of taking one for the team, of going out there sometimes, doing something that they don't like doing, going on the media round, talking to people like us, and defending something that, you know what, they don't really want to defend. When I did Wes Streeting yesterday about Diane Abbott, you could kind of tell that he was uncomfortable. You could kind of tell that really in his heart of hearts, he probably has a certain view about what's happening with Diane Abbott, but probably doesn't like it. But he was being a good party man. He was doing what he was told. He was taking one for the team. That's partly about his ambition, yeah, but it's also partly because he cares about his party getting into government.
But okay, you talk about that. We were talking on the podcast yesterday and the whole latest kind of manoeuvrings of the Diane Abbott story, and we were saying, is this Labour leadership by diktat? Is there a purge going on? Is it undemocratic? And you seem to be now being the cheerleader for that, saying there has to be discipline.
You're saying I might be inconsistent, John.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm saying I'm saying you're a bloody Stalinist, that everyone has to march in a certain direction at the same pace, otherwise you'll be booted out.
I'm not, and I think that when there are matters of real conscience, I think it matters so much more. So, for example, Robin Cook. Everyone always talks about Robin Cook when he resigned because of the Iraq War in 2003, that amazing speech in 2003. he had been Labour Foreign Secretary. At that time, he was Leader of the House. He was a big figure in the early to middle years of the new Labour period, right? He'd been a very senior figure. It mattered so much more that he resigned about that he wasn't a serial rebel, that he wasn't always just basically, speaking about anything that took his mind and took his fancy, as someone like Corbyn would have done.
Corbyn was always
a rebelling maverick, whatever. I think Corbyn was the most rebellious Labour MP at one point, because he chose his moment, because he was a party man, because he would take one for the team, because he would swallow, as any MP who is elected as a party ought to do, to recognise that it is not just about them. And it's not just about the party, it's about the party because the party is the vehicle through which, in a democratic system, a parliamentary system, you achieve the change you want to see. So it matters that the party has cohesion.
Yeah.
And then we venerate them for when it really matters, they're willing to step outside and do what's right.
I tell you what, Jack, it would be great to...
Jack? Oh, Jack's our guy. I think I'm all right, Jack.
No, I'm just speaking to the guy who had the decency.
I know you get confused sometimes. That's all, John. I just know
you
you
were
get a bit
happy to do
confused.
AUP impressions. I am speaking to Jack directly and respectfully.
Apologies.
Jeez. Jack, I think what would be really interesting is to see what happens to Jeremy Corbyn in this election when he has stood independently, and whether he finds that he can muster the support without having the imprimatur of the Labour Party as backing him.
One from Ben here. My question is, what are the merits of spoiling your ballot paper as a protest against all the parties?
I think next to none, to be honest.
Waste of time.
Waste of time.
Might as well just not go.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, funnily enough, in Australia, where there is compulsory voting, there is a merit to spoiling your ballot because
you're being forced.
You're being forced and you are making some kind of statement. And in the US, of course, you can write write somebody's name on the ballot who may not even be standing. Yeah. And there's a female senator in Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, who won her Senate seat because enough people wrote her name and beat the Republican and Democrat choices for that election. But generally, in the British context, what's the point?
What's the point? Just don't bother turning up. Think of the council worker who is up at 3:00 in the morning counting the ballots. They don't need one that doesn't say anything.
Yeah,
just going to confuse.
And also
people.
the amount of time that is taken up by saying, is that a tick or a cross, and can we accept it or not? If you've ever covered a by-election count, which we have probably far too many of, the amount of time you think, come on, we're near the bloody end. I want to go to bed. It's 3:30 in the morning. Why are we arguing about 15 spoilt ballot papers?
Angry John Sopel there, getting angry about.
I'm going to take my meds now.
Yeah, okay,
I'll be back calm in the second half.
Nurse is coming round, and we'll see you in the second half. Welcome back, Jack, and everybody else. Just to remind you as well, we are going to be here on Sunday with the latest from the campaign and all of the interviews on all the Sunday shows, including Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC.
Sunday with who?
Lewis Goodall. I hear he's very inconsistent. His views all over the place, I hear, unfortunately. But we have a voice note from Ellen to kick us off for this second half.
Hey newsagents, it's Ellen Brenchley here. I want to know what happens if the Conservatives lose the election and Rishi Sunak resigns the next morning. What's the process for electing a new Tory leader?
This is a really good question. So I've been thinking about this because actually, in some ways, I can't think of a recent precedent or any precedent for one reason, right? So the last time the Conservatives lost office and then were therefore the opposition was obviously 1997. And John Major, actually, which people forget now, John, you might remember this, obviously was leader of the opposition for a brief period and had to do PMQs against Blair. In
all his pomp.
He just won like over 400 seats, majority of over 170, and John Major, who just led his party to the worst defeat since universal suffrage, basically has to come in tail between his legs. Quite humiliating. But then, you see, there was a short contest because it was still just the MPs. So it wasn't for very long. Now, obviously, there's a longer contest because it involves the members. And if Sunak doesn't go, or if Sunak goes immediately, which has become the custom, really, then, unlike the Labour Party, they don't have a deputy leader. They don't have an official deputy leader who kind of takes over as acting leader. There is Oliver Dowden, who is currently Deputy Prime Minister, but that's just a sort of government thing on Sunak's wishes. So it would be a bit unclear if Sunak Watt just said, right, that's it, I'm off, I don't want to be leader anymore, and just perform the leader of the opposition job just on an interim basis, it's not entirely clear what the Conservative Party would do. They might just go for Dowden as a sort of acting leader of the opposition, or they might find some constitutional provision, dust it down within the Conservative constitution to just elect someone as a temporary leader while they have the main contest, because it will take some time. But it is an unusual situation. It's not entirely clear.
I suppose what they would do is they would have to appoint... Sunak would have to appoint a shadow cabinet if he's just lost.
Yeah.
And because they will need to have people in place who can be, when it's defence questions, the shadow defence secretary is there.
The cleanest thing for him, it would be to stay on. The cleanest thing for the party would be for him to just stay on a temporary basis. It's just about whether he would be willing to do that.
And then you either have the shadow deputy leader standing in, or you have the shadow leader of the House, because that used to be the tradition, where it was the shadow leader of the House who would stand in when the leader of the opposition was away. And so...
Could be the chairman of the 22. The 1922 committee is the
backbench
committee of backbench Tory MPs. But of course that would have to be elected as well, because the current chairman of the 22, Graham Brady, is standing down at the election, so there'll have to be a new chairman of the 22. So, it could all get very complicated, but they would have to decide it pretty quickly, because there'll be the election and then Parliament will reconvene, a new Parliament, the week after there'll be the state opening, all of this sort of thing. And, you have to have a leader of the opposition to represent the opposition, assuming the Conservatives lose, as part of the constitutional process.
The one thing that Rishi Sunak has said is that he's not going off to California. He hasn't bought his family one-way tickets to San Francisco.
Yes.
And that he is going to stay in his constituency. We will see, obviously, we'll see what happens in the election, and we'll see what happens with that pledge afterwards. But he's planning to stick around in Parliament representing North Yorkshire.
One of my favourite bit of leaders of the opposition trivia is, I was thinking about this the other day and had to look it up because I realised I didn't know. Do you know what happened during the war when Labour went into government?
Yeah, so it's a national government.
So it was a national government. But then who, in parliamentary terms, was performing the sort of role of leader of the opposition? Yeah. And the Liberals were in the government as well, so it wasn't them. Do you know what happened? So I didn't know. So Labour basically had to kind of appoint a sort of almost sort of sinecure kind of leader of the opposition, just to kind of go through the motions of it having an opposition, even though it was a national government. So it was Hastings Lees Smith, and then Frederick Pethick Lawrence, who, among others, were the pretend leaders of opposition during that time.
So they were the opposition to Winston Churchill.
And Clement Attlee, their own leader, yeah. But it was just because Parliament can't function, right, without having an opposition. There's just no way it can sort of properly function. So despite the fact that the Labour Party were in the national government, you had to have almost a sort of pretend leader of the opposition who would just go through the motions of it. So there you go.
Well, Lewis Goodall, you've told me
the history agents.
Yeah, the history agents. That was good. I like that.
Little
That was worth the price of admission alone. Right, high news agents. The Lib Dems campaign doesn't yet seem to have made a splash. Oh, I know what's coming next. Despite Ed Davies' visit to Lake Windermere, the polls don't seem to be pretty reading for the Liberal Democrats. They're on 9% and are behind the Reform Party, who are on 12%. Should they be concerned about this polling? What is their strategy to improve their numbers? And that's from Tom in Leatherhead.
It is a really interesting question, and I've spoken to a few different people in both the Conservative and Labour parties who are surprised that the Lib Dems have not managed to add more to their national polling or get ahead of it. If you talk to the Lib Dems, what they'll say is that the national polling indicator for them is less relevant because they are targeting heavily in a few score of seats where they think they are really competitive, and they think that tactical voting will help them enormously. Basically, as we've seen in by-elections and local elections, that the non-Conservative vote will coalesce around them in seats where it's obvious they will be the big challengers to the Conservatives, a la 1997. So they'll say that the national polling indicator is not very relevant for them.
Yes, and they will say, look, if you look at what happened in the local council elections, where you saw the Greens doing extremely well, there are very few seats in Britain where the Greens are going to be competitive to win the actual parliamentary seat. And so what you will see is, in an area where maybe Labour did very well in the local council elections, but are not the main challenger, they will do appallingly in the general election, and people will coalesce around the Liberals because they will see the Liberal Democrats as the main challenger, and you will see acute tactical voting, and that's the hope for the Liberal Democrats. But they are not the force that they were in the lead up to, say, the 97 election campaign, where you could see that actually the Liberal Democrats were doing pretty well.
They've never really recovered from the coalition. Not
No,
really.
not
Not
really.
properly. They've had little moments where they have, particularly during Brexit referendum, and of course they've been doing brilliantly in by-elections. But generally speaking, as a sort of proper political force, well, to be specific, they've never really recovered from 2015, where they lost nearly all their seats. It hasn't been easy for them. We've got a voice note or another question from Anthony.
Hello, newsagents. Hope you're well. My question is, what happens if the leader of the winning party fails to win their own constituency seat? Does this mean that they are unable to be Prime Minister, and that then triggers a leadership election within that party, which would obviously then delay the announcement of the new Prime Minister by a matter of further weeks? Or is there an emergency ability for that party to just choose its own leader immediately? Or does the leader then do something a little bit like David Cameron and end up being placed into the House of Lords to serve as Prime Minister, but from the House of Lords, which obviously would be a bit odd because they would then not be able to answer Prime Minister questions and be perceived as probably slightly less accountable. Anyway, hope that's clear. Sending this message from North Yorkshire in Richmond.
Just
Who
wondering-
might you have on your mind,
Who might you have
Anthony?
in mind in Richmond, North Yorkshire?
This is such a good question.
It's
This
a
is
brilliant
such a fun
question, isn't it? Go on.
Yeah. Well, there is no modern
No.
precedent because Prime Ministers tend to have very safe seats because they can have their pick of the seats once they become Prime Minister party leader, but also, usually you've got longevity as a politician if you become Prime Minister, which normally means you have a safe seat because you can weather the ups and downs of electoral politics. There is a precedent going way back, which is Arthur Balfour. So he was Conservative Prime Minister until the end 1905, start of 1906. He lost his seat in the Great Liberal landslide of 1906. He basically came back in a by-election very shortly afterwards. So that's how they did it then. But obviously it was a lot less formal there, and in terms of party leadership, there's no party members' votes and everything. I think what would happen in reality is that if a Prime Minister lost their seat, that they would just resign as party leader because the humiliation of losing your seat. So if Sunak were to lose his seat, he would simply resign as party leader. I think it's in the Conservative constitution that you have to be an MP to be Conservative party leader anyway. I think I'm right in saying, someone might correct me, but I think I'm right in saying that the Labour Party leader can be someone who's not an MP, potentially, but obviously the leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party can't be. And the leader of the parliamentary party is obviously the person who would be Prime Minister or leader of the opposition. So there was this debate that was being had. The reason I think this is because there was a debate that was being had in the Corbyn years about whether the PLP could basically divorce themselves and declare themselves independent of the Labour Party overall, have their own leader as the leader of the PLP and so on. But I think it might be possible that you could have a leader of the Labour Party who was not an MP, but I think in reality, practically, it would never happen.
Yeah, it just can't happen. And if you think about the process of what happens after a general election, we don't elect a prime minister in this country. We elect parties, and the party that commands a majority, the leader of that is invited to form a government. And so you have the king saying, I invite you to try and form a government. And that's why when there's a hung parliament, you get all sorts of additional complications over who it is that the king should invite first of all. And, if you go back to 2010, and there was an initial period after the 2010 election when Gordon Brown has lost, but Cameron hasn't got a clear majority, that Gordon Brown stayed in number 10 for a while and was trying to work out ways that he could form a minority administration, even though it was clear that the British people had voted against him. If you haven't got a leader, if you haven't got an MP who is the person who can be your next Prime Minister, you would have to go to someone else. And I think the party would probably have to come up with some very hastily cobbled together acting leader role who would be, let's face it, it's not going to happen this time round. I mean, I cannot believe that Rishi Sunak is going to lose in Richmond, North Yorkshire, and I cannot believe that Keir Starmer is going to lose in North London.
And anyway, even if Sunak did, like I say, I think that would in a way be the perfect out for him. He wouldn't have to do the thing we were just talking about, which is the humiliation of having to be leader of the opposition.
And then he could go to California.
And then he could go to California.
He could say the rules have changed.
The most. I mean, obviously, you could theoretically try and do what Balfour did and have a by-election, but the most recent kind of precedent for that then wouldn't it be, you remember this was Patrick Gordon Walker, who had been Labour Foreign Secretary. He lost his seat in Leighton, and then they had a by-election which he didn't win and so Harold Wilson had to put him into the Lords. But that was so you try and have a by-election, you basically get rid of the local MP have a by-election, but the local voters don't like that because they think they're being manipulated and played with, and so he didn't win it.
You know, the one that I remember most clearly in my lifetime was the kind of, for a dramatic seat loss, was Chris Patten, when the Tories had won the election in 92 and beaten Kinnock against the odds, and John Major had a majority, and the chairman of the Conservative Party, Chris Patten, had lost his seat. And he was kind of, you know, so on the one hand, he was sort of trying to celebrate the Tory victory at the same time as thinking, oh, my parliamentary career is over.
One quick last one. From Stuart in Bristol, the news of boundary changes came and went without a word that it benefited the Conservatives. Can you help me understand the purpose of the changes and how it will actually impact the elections?
So what you're trying to do with boundary changes is to have constituencies that are, broadly speaking, the same size, so that you've got the same number of voters in each constituency. And as people move around the country, and as kind of small towns become big towns, or big cities become smaller cities, or there's urban or rural depopulation, you try to manage it so that you have got constituencies that are roughly the same shape and size as each other, so that no one constituency is kind of like a rotten borough where there are very few people electing them.
Yes, it's to try and make sure that your vote is as equal as much as possible with someone else's votes. And there are and it just takes account for population changes. So like somewhere like London has just gained a few seats because there's been population increase since the last boundary change, and areas like the West Midlands has gone down a little bit, or Wales and Scotland have gone down a little bit because of relative population changes. The boundary review process is really, really controversial and difficult, right? Because the Boundary Commission comes along every 10 years. They come along and they say, right, these are our proposals. And then loads of MPs complain because, right, you're sat there thinking, wow, I finally made it to the House of Commons. I've got a 20,000 majority. Here I am. I'm going to be a minister. I'm going to be a prime minister, whatever. And then the Boundary Commission come along, right?
And carve your constituency.
Carved your constituency. Suddenly you look at the wards and you work it out and think, Christ, my majority's gone down to 500 or 1,000 or whatever it is. And so all the MPs complain, say, no, you can't possibly have St Anne's ward in my constituency. That's been in the other constituency for 100 years. All of this sort of stuff. Electors complain about it. And then they complain most of all about the names, because sometimes they don't like being lumped together with a neighbouring place because they think it's sort of bad for house prices or whatever it happens to be. So it gets very, very technical and very, very fun.
Can I just say one area where I think the Boundary Commission ought to work is in the United States of America.
Yes.
Where you
Thank goodness for the Boundary Commission.
I mean, honestly, you have got Senate seats. So every state in the US, the 50 states, have 2 senators. North Dakota, South Dakota have 4 senators and a combined population of 1.5 million. California has 2 senators, population 27 million. How is it that the 2 Dakotas can outvote California with, a fraction of the population?
Or even more so, you don't. What it means is, in having the Boundary Commission, is we don't get gerrymandering. Gerrymandering being the process that you get in the United States in the House, where basically local state legislatures draw the boundaries of their districts, the equivalent of constituencies, in such a way as to basically include all of your voters, exclude all of your other parties' voters. So you get these bizarre looking, sometimes they literally run down a highway or something like that. Look it up if you're interested. They're bizarre. And the reason it's called gerrymandering, it was named after a person who basically was thought to have sort of started this practice, who was called Jerry, and it ended up looking, this constituency, this district, like a salamander. So it ended up being called gerrymander. So that's where it comes from. And one bit of trivia, John. What's the smallest constituency and what has been the largest constituency? Because there are exceptions to the rule you just articulated.
So I would think that the Shetlands or somewhere like that would be the smallest constituency, because you've got a vastly huge geographical area but a very tiny population.
I think, if memory serves, actually it's very close. I think it's the Western Isles.
Yeah.
So, but basically the same thing. I think Orkney and Shetland would be second. Yeah, I think. So there you go. And the largest, which they've just abolished, actually. They've just drawn it into 2, but it's very controversial on the island, which gives you a...
Isle of Wight.
The Isle of Wight. That's right.
So when I first started my journalistic career, there was just one.
Of course you'd know that. Of course, yeah.
Well, Stephen Ross was the MP, Liberal Democrat.
Well, there has been until now. It's very controversial because it means one of the constituencies will be joined with the mainland. And that has been extremely controversial on the Isle of Wight.
I can see that would be. We'll be back in just a second. Right, one final question. And this is from Sound and Fury on Twitter. How hard is it to stand as an independent candidate. I feel we ought to have Count Binface in here.
We did.
We did. No, we did. That's very true. We have had Count Binface on before. You're going to be coming back.
How hard? So this is more about the practicalities of standing. I mean, the answer is it's very hard. I mean, it's very hard to win. I mean, it's not hard, I suppose, in the sense of, I mean, the threshold to it, unlike, say, some of the United States elections where you need lots and lots of signatures. I think you only need 10 signatures from a constituency. Look, if you've got any family and friends, if you can't get 10 people, including yourself, then maybe you should be doing something else. You need 500 quid, you need a deposit, which you can get back if you get 5% of the vote. As long as you get 5% of the vote, then you get your 500 quid back, but you need to put your 500 quid down in order to stand. That is there to try and discourage just joke candidates the entire time. And beyond that, it's up to you. And lots of independent candidates do stand. But obviously, if you're an independent, unless you're standing, as we've already talked about, for a very specific reason, like a kind of lightning rod issue, or you're very well known, like Jeremy Corbyn is, because you've been associated with a party, the chances of getting sort of name recognition, door knocking, apparatus, party machinery, leaflets, spending the money. It can be very expensive running for Parliament beyond the initial 500 quid. All of that, it's prohibitive, and that is why
you get your
independents
election
don't win.
addresses? I mean, if you want to send out a leaflet to everyone in the constituency, isn't the mail paid if you're a candidate? I think it is, or it used to be. I mean, maybe that's a kind of going back to a sort of linear age, and we're in a digital age now where that doesn't happen so much. But I think that if you are standing as a candidate, your postage costs are covered.
Yeah, but at the same time, you've got to get someone to
produce the leaflets and all the rest of it.
You need. I mean, you have someone very important for you, and any MP will tell you you have a party agent who is there, sort of your sort of representative, if you like, as part of the entire sort of process. They look after all the legal stuff. They're liable for you if you break electoral law, all of these sorts of things. And there are lots of bits of electoral law that you have to navigate, which don't need to detain us, but it can be serious if you break them under the Representation of the People Act. So, it is a complicated business, particularly if you are serious about it and you actually want to get some votes for any particular reason. It's not easy. The parties are gateways to it, and unless you've got a very good reason around which your campaign can cohere, I mean, probably the best example, going back a bit now, but of course you remember Richard Taylor from the Wire Forest, who stood for the Kidderminster Health Action Concern, I think it was called, or words to that effect. Basically, the then Labour government back in 2001 were trying to close down Kidderminster Hospital, and he had been a doctor in the hospital, and he managed to kind of galvanise a real local campaign about saving the hospital, and I think he got re-elected. I think 2 terms he ended up serving for, but in the end even he lost a seat. So very occasionally lightning can strike and something can happen, but it's really hard.
We will be back with more of your questions next week.
Yes.
Yes.
More fun and games.
More fun and games.
And Sunday. Don't forget about Sunday.
Not forgetting about Sunday, but more obscure knowledge from Lewis about who acted as opposition spokesman during the Second World War.
You're not getting that on The Rest is Politics, are you? Bunch of dunces.
See you.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.